Destination COP28, Professor Saleemul Dialogue. Join us on the Climate Channel's South Asian Environment Dialogue pre-COP Analysis. The talk show will focus and provide insights into the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in Dubai from November 30th to December 12th, 2023. Janta Basu is discussing with prominent.
Welcome to Destination COP28, Professor Saleemul Dialogue. You know that in this particular series of programs leading to COP28 in Dubai, which is going to start within few days, we are discussing about the various facets and various issues of concern in COP28, which the way it may kind of unfurl in COP28. And today we are going to discuss about the issue. I think one of the major issues that may come up in COP28 is the loss and damage. And I have the person who is at the center of it, Harjeet Singh, my very good friend. Harjeet is the Global Political Strategy Head of Climate Action Network International. Harjeet, welcome to the show. I know that you are so busy leading to COP, but thank you for your time. And this, before I just go into very quickly into the agenda of loss and damage, let me share with you that when we are planning this program that I discussed with you, one of the first names that we discussed was Professor Saleemul, whom we lost so suddenly. And it is so unfamiliar to have a COP without Professor Saleemul. So, and also you and Professor Hawk fought shoulder to shoulder from civil society in Sharm el-Sheikh. We all saw how you fought and could actually bring that change. So, any thought on that? Your responsibility has become doubled. You have to really work double to compensate the loss of Saleemul.
Indeed. So thank you, Janta, for having me. I don't think anybody can replace or fit into the big shoes of Saleem, but definitely because we work very closely, particularly on the issues of adaptation and loss and damage, I am definitely going to redouble my efforts to make sure that I contribute a lot more than what I have been doing, because the fight is not yet over, as you know, and we are going to COP28 where the decision may be adopted, but it doesn't go far enough. And if Saleem had been there, he would not have, celebrated it. Of course, we would have resolved that the fight continues. So I'm going to keep putting more and more efforts to make sure that his legacy is there.
That is so much important. That is so much important. Harjeet, let's go to the point straight away. The loss and damage. As you all know, as you just referred, how it kind of panned out in last COP. And now this transitional committee, and you were an observer member in that committee, and there was a series of meetings, and I wouldn't say very satisfactory meetings. But finally, something cobbled up recently in early November, and you have come to a more or less an agreement. Tell us, what is that drop says, and what that drop means, more important.
Yeah, Janta, I would call it a compromise, and a compromise where developing countries were pushed to the corner. And they had to mainly agree that loss and damage fund is now going to be hosted by the World Bank. And we all know the challenges we face with the World Bank in terms of its role in even causing the climate crisis by continuing to fund fossil fuels, but also it doesn't provide access to all countries. And in this fund, we are also aiming to have communities having direct access to the fund, unlike Green Climate Fund. So there were many challenges.
Just to clarify it, you were saying that communities can get directly fund from it?
Absolutely.
That's been agreed upon?
That agreement has been made, and now World Bank has to make sure that it's going to provide access to communities, of course, through their organizations and setups, but communities can access the fund. And that was the main fight that we had. And in fact, we had proposed that last year, that this fund has to be very different from all the conventional funding mechanisms that we have seen, because we are talking about communities not having adequate support to recover from rising climate impacts. And money needs to be provided in a speedy manner. It has to be adequate, and it has to support communities. So what better would be the mechanism where, while we depend on governments, of course, because they have to rebuild infrastructure, but we also want to make sure that communities are not ruled out of this process and they have direct access. And I think that is something which now World Bank has to agree. So when developing countries agreed to have the World Bank, because rich countries kept saying, if we go for an existing institution, we'll be able to start rolling out processes much faster and money can be delivered in a much more speedy manner. Now they have to demonstrate it's a reality. Now World Bank has to agree to those conditions of accessibility, and rich countries agreeing to put money at scale. And that compromise has been reached. Of course, there are some missing elements. Jayanta, for instance, scale has not been mentioned. We know that it's reaching hundreds of billions of dollars. It doesn't really gives us enough confidence on the initial capitalization, which means that money needs to be provided to the fund to start the secretariat, but also make the first round of disbursements and then a replenishment plan. So that language is very weak. And what we want to see happening at COP28, first of all, right at the beginning itself, this decision should be adopted, should not be reopened. Even if you are not happy with it, a lot of political capital has gone into this process. So let us bank it, build on it. There are other processes such as global stocktake. We have discussions on finance where we can include it, and the cover decision. We have sent direct messages to Dr. Sultan Al Jaber as COP president that while we acknowledge that he also played an important role because the last meeting happened in Abu Dhabi to get the agreement, but it doesn't go far enough. So we have to have some language in the cover decision to strengthen it further.
Harjeet, just kind of trying to understand that this funding, loss and damage funding, will just like adaptation funding or GCF, are the developed countries going to put specific money into this fund and then World Bank will manage it? Is that this process?
Absolutely. And I must also say that this decision has been influenced massively by the US, because US was saying that if the money goes through the World Bank, then they'll be in a much better position to provide money. And we know how they have not fulfilled their previous commitments. So the argument of having World Bank as an intermediary in many ways to host the fund than a standalone independent fund that developing countries have been demanding, it will be much resourced.
But it's a temporary funding. I think developing countries have agreed to a temporary role.
It's going to be for 4 years. So it is interim. And that's why those conditionalities are important. And there are several checkpoints. The first checkpoint comes in a few months when World Bank says, yes, they are going to agree to those conditions. The second checkpoint is where they're going to demonstrate by the paperwork that they have done it. And the third checkpoint is the performance 3 years later.
Is it required to be kind of formally accepted in the next COP and be part of the cover decision?
That's exactly what's going to happen. And in fact, we are expecting it to happen in the first few days of the COP itself, because the idea is to also rebuild trust, because that is a main argument. Imagine if developed countries had not agreed to loss and damage fund being operationalized, it would have just blown everything up. You can't get any other agreement. When people are suffering, you're not helping them, and you are pressurizing developing countries to do more on mitigation. It just doesn't stand on its legs. So that's why it was important.
Another thing, Harjeet, I'm told that the US said that all the term fund in the agreement should also have voluntary.
Oh yeah, that was the biggest. That was the biggest reason why US did not agree to the draft in the initial few days after the transitional committee meeting, because they wanted this to be voluntary for even developed countries. Whereas the language that we have secured in the draft decision is developed countries have to take a lead while others can put money as a voluntary effort. Now, that is the fair part. We know that scale is huge. We know that there are certain countries in the Gulf states or otherwise who have more capacity than other developing countries. But at the same time, morally, it won't be right, because climate crisis is the result of 150 plus years of emissions and not in the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, we have seen certain countries who have become more economically well off, so they can be invited to contribute, but not forced. So that is a moral argument that we were making. And we hope that we stay with that for now.
That will carry through. That will push through. And another point, very importantly, is that you talked about who is going to pay. We assume that developed countries will be paying it. Who are going to get it? only the least developed countries, also the developing countries, the emerging economies like India. You also mentioned in the beginning that it's not really a nation-wise fund, it's also a community-wise fund. So how you see this mapping of the vulnerable communities, and is there any formal mapping being made, or who are going to get this money? Any clarity on that as of now?
So I think it's important to understand the politics behind it. Why developed countries kept pushing that it has to be limited to small island states and least developed countries. It's basically to minimize and narrow their obligation. Small island states, while they are highly vulnerable, you only need a few millions to support them. And LDCs, people still don't realize, Jayanta, it's a dynamic list. Bhutan is going to be out of this list this month. And Bangladesh and Nepal are going to be out of that list in November 2026, which means in the next 20 years, we may only have 10, 15, 20 countries left. So basically, their obligation continues to go down, whereas climate vulnerability has been increasing over the last 30 years. So that's why it was important to ensure that all developing countries are eligible. Yes, we can have some differentiation based on capacity. We know that LDCs and SIDS and some other countries are far more vulnerable. We have seen what happened in Pakistan. Why not talk about Libya? We have seen even Nigeria struggling, right? Indonesia, Malaysia. So those countries also need support.
So basically, as of now, the developing countries should be eligible as of now if the draft goes through. Now, finally, that how you see, you are part of this transitional committee meetings all through, have seen how the developed countries are doing it. Now, final question, how hopeful you are about this loss and damage, whatever being actually agreed upon will be carried through. You said in the first few days, but is it really going to happen?
Well, I'm hopeful because
the war being breaking out, there's Israel, Hamas, and all these things are going out.
See, we are in a very difficult context right now with two wars, and war in Gaza is just 2,500 kilometers away. So imagine how the region is already embroiled in this situation. What we also need to understand that while we get this decision, as I said earlier, it doesn't go far enough. So we are not going to be celebrating it. But it does send a signal of hope that the multilateral process is alive, is listening. However, it's not ready to support communities at a scale at which they need it. That's why we will continue to fight to strengthen the decision in the days after this decision is announced. At the same time, Janta, the most important thing as we go to UAE, an oil producing nation, loss and damage doesn't happen in isolation. If we are not able to reduce emissions from burning fossil fuels and temperature rise and do not provide adequate support to communities to adapt, we are going to see more and more loss and damage. Look at what's happening in Sundarbans. Who knows better than you that we have not provided sufficient support to communities in Sundarbans to even adapt, right? And as sea level continues to rise because of rising temperatures, they are the ones who are most vulnerable. So we don't just talk about loss and damage. You have to look at the continuum and the whole spectrum of climate action.
And I hope that this continuum of action, as you mentioned about the mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, this linkage will be more forcefully pushed forward by the Global South, South Asian countries, and the civil society. Thank you, Harjeet, for your time. I think looking forward to a meaningful way forward of loss and damage. We have seen, after a long while, a victory of civil society and the Global South, the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, when the developed countries had to accept the loss and damage finance facility after a lot of this kind of reservation. But we hope that this COP, the coming COP, this will be further pushed forward. Finger crossed. Thank you, Harjeet, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janta. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
It's a pleasure and privilege to talk to you always. Thank you.